changing the world of work for women everywhere. We are Watermark. We're the only nonprofit women's leadership organization that spans all industries. We connect, develop, and advocate for the advancement of women in the workplace. The Watermark community includes senior executives, entrepreneurs, and emerging executives that support you not only at the top of your field, but also on your way up.
This is literally my copy of the book that I, in one night, got through the entire thing, ran through with a highlighter. I ran out of a highlighter because this book was so darn good. So I can't wait to hear from Kim.
Thank you so much. I'm going to tweet your book at the end of the night. I'm so flattered that you actually used up a whole highlighter. I love that story. It's maybe my favorite story of the whole year. So it's such an honor to be here, and I want to thank all of you very much. I know it's hard to take time at the end of the day, so I really appreciate it. And I hope that the idea of radical candor will help each and every one of you not only do the best work of your lives and help your teams do the best work of their lives, but form the best relationships of your career while you're at it. We spend more time at work than in any other part of our lives. We may as well have real relationships there. So what I want to do to start off, to explain what I mean by radical candor, is just tell a quick story about a time when my boss criticized me. I had just started at Google, and I had to give a presentation on how the AdSense business that I was leading was doing to the founders and the CEO. And I walked into the room, and there in the corner on an elliptical trainer is Sergey in a blue spandex unitard and toe shoes. And there in the other corner is Eric Schmidt, the CEO, so deep in his email, it's like his brain has been plugged into his computer and there's no pulling it out. And so, like any normal person in this situation, I felt a little bit nervous. I wasn't sure how in the world I was going to get their attention. Luckily, the business that I was leading was on fire. And when I said how many new customers we had added over the last couple of months, Eric's head snaps up out of his computer, and he says, "What did you say?" And when I repeated the number, he almost fell off his chair. And he said, "What do you need? Do you need more marketing dollars? Do you need more engineers?" And so I'm thinking, like, the meeting's going all right. You know, in fact, I'm feeling like a genius. And when it's over, as I was walking out of the room, my boss, Sheryl Sandberg, says, "Why don't you walk back to my office with me?" Now, I'm not feeling like such a genius. I think I screwed something up. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure I'm about to hear about it. And she starts off the conversation by telling me what went well in the meeting. Not in a feedback sandwich kind of way, but genuinely what went well. She told me some stuff I didn't know, but of course, all I really wanted to hear about was what had I screwed up. And eventually she says to me, "You said a lot in there. Were you aware of it?" And I breathed a huge sigh of relief, because if that was all I did, who really cared? And I kind of made this brush-off gesture with my hand, and I said, "Yeah, no, it's kind of a verbal tic. No big deal, really." And then she said, "I know this really good speech coach. Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction?" And I did this thing again. I said, "No, didn't you hear about all the new customers we have? I'm busy. I don't have time to go see a speech coach." And then Sheryl stopped in her tracks. She looked right at me and she said, "I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid and insecure." Now she has my full attention, right? That was not really what I was shooting for. And some people would say that it was mean of Sheryl to say that, but in fact, it was the kindest thing she could possibly have done for me at that moment in my career. If she had been talking to somebody else on her team, somebody maybe a little bit less bullheaded than I am, somebody who's maybe a little bit of a better listener, she wouldn't have had to say it that strongly. But in order to get through to me, those were the words she had to use. And because she used them, and only because she used them, did I go to see the speech coach. And I realized when I did that Cheryl was not exaggerating. I really did say every third word. And this was really surprising to me because I had been giving presentations for my whole career. I had raised $35 million for my startup giving presentations. I thought I was pretty good at it. And so this made me think two things, really. What was it that Cheryl did that made it so easy for her, seemingly easy anyway, to give me that feedback? But really more interestingly, why had nobody else ever told me? It was like I'd been walking through my entire career with a huge hunk of spinach between my teeth, and nobody had given me the common courtesy to tell me. I could have fixed the problem if I had known it was a problem, but I didn't know. I wasn't aware. We often aren't aware of our own problems. And I realized it was really two pretty simple things that Cheryl did that made it easy for her. She cared personally about not just me, but everyone who worked for her. When I first moved to California from New York to take the job at Google, I didn't know anyone here. And Cheryl, to make sure I felt welcome and to make sure I had some friends, invited me to join her book group, knowing that I loved to read and also to write. When I had a relative get ill, she said, go, fly, be with that, be with your family. Don't think about us. We've got you covered here. Don't count it as vacation time. This is when your team steps in to fill the void for you. We're here to cover for you. And those were the kinds of things, she didn't just do them for me. She did them for everyone who worked for her. So there was no doubt in anyone's mind but that Cheryl had our back, that she cared about us not just as employees, but as human beings. Not friends, it wasn't friendship, but as human beings. It was a different kind of relationship, but a real human relationship. At the same time, she didn't let her concern and her care for hurting our feelings get in the way of her ability to challenge us really directly when we needed it. So it was the combination of that ability to care personally and challenge directly. Now, I spent 2 years at business school, 1 summer at McKinsey, and I learned one thing in that period of time, and that is that all of life's problems can be boiled down to a good 2x2. So here's my 2x2, right? Care personally, challenge directly. And so what I want to do is take each dimension in turn and sort of take a look at it and try to understand and unpack why we might fail on one dimension or another. So first, care personally. This is what I call the give a damn axis. Now, how is it that anyone can fail on this dimension of radical candor? I mean, nobody I've ever met starts their career out thinking, I don't care at all about other people, so I think I'm going to be a great leader, right? That's not how it works. And maybe some cases it does, but I've never met that person. So what is it that moves us down on the care personally axis? I think this begins when we're 18, 19, 20 years old. We're right at that moment in our careers, in our lives really, when our egos are still incredibly fragile, but our personas are beginning to solidify, to protect us, to protect those fragile egos. And right at that moment, somebody comes along and tells us, be professional. And for an awful lot of people, that gets translated to mean leave your emotions, leave who you really are, leave your humanity, leave the very best part of yourself at home, and come to work as something slightly less than human. That is how we fall down on the care personally axis. It's very hard to care personally about other people with some small fraction of ourselves. So I think it's really important to be, I'm not saying be unprofessional, But you've got to be more than just professional. You've got to be able to bring your whole self to work and to create an environment in which it's possible for the people around you also to bring their whole selves to work. That doesn't mean come to work and feel free to be a jerk and just say, that's who I am. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you've had a bad night, if you've been up all night for some reason, and you're not at your best, just say, look, I'm not at my best today. Otherwise, people assume it's their fault that you're in a bad mood. If you just own your own stuff, it makes a huge difference. So bring your whole self to work. At the very top of the care personally dimension of radical candor is actually love. Not love in the family-destroying, HR problematic, sense of the word, but we spend so much time at work, we may as well really love the people we work with, if at all possible. Now, unfortunately, however, love is not all you need. You also need the other dimension, right? You also need to be able to challenge people directly. This is what I call the willing to piss people off axis, right? Colin Powell said that leadership often means being willing to piss people off. Now, it hardly seems worth asking why we're unwilling to piss people off. We know we don't want to do that. We're all social creatures, and at some point in time, we would have been left in the forest to die if we pissed people off too much. So it's very instinctive not to do that. But I think the problem here actually begins not when you're 18 years old, but when you're 18 months old. How many of you had a parent who said to you some version of, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all, right? And the interesting thing about this is that some version of that expression exists in every culture on earth. I spent a bunch of time in Russia, and the version of the saying in Russian, am I allowed to curse here?
Yes.
Okay, so the version of the saying in Russian is, don't poke your finger in a pile of shit, it stinks, right? Same idea, basically, just put a little bit more crudely. Like every culture on earth has some version of this saying. And so this has been training that's been pounded into your head since you learned to speak. And now you become a leader of some sort. And it's your job to say it. And that is hard. It is really hard to undo an instinct that was born when you were 18 months old. So that's why radical candor is hard. And it's not just your job, actually. When you're a leader, it's your moral obligation. People don't see when they're making a mistake. It's up to you to tell them in time to give them the opportunity to fix the problem that you're seeing. If you don't tell them, maybe because you don't want to hurt their feelings, you wind up having to fire them, which is not so nice after all. So it's your moral obligation. So that is radical candor, and that's why radical candor is hard. 18 years old, be professional. 18 months old, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. You have to really fight on both dimensions in order to be radically candid. You have to fight with instincts that are normal and human, and we all share them. One of the things that I did that made it easier for me to remember to be radically candid, and seems to have helped a lot of other people, is to name what happens when we fail on one dimension or another with some sort of colorful language. So when you challenge people directly in a way that fails to show them, maybe you really do care, but you fail to show them that you care, I call that obnoxious aggression. Now, early on, I used to call this the asshole quadrant, technical term. And I don't do that anymore, and I don't do it for a very specific reason. And the reason is that everybody makes mistakes. Everybody, and this framework is really useless if you start to use it to judge yourself or to judge other people. This framework actually becomes damaging if you use it as labels for personality. So I beg you, as I go through this, don't start writing names in boxes, right? It's very tempting to do. It's the most common mistake that people make. But I'll tell stories about times when I have been in each of the quadrants. And I will assert I'm not, in general, obnoxiously aggressive, but I do sometimes fall into that quadrant. We all do. So use this framework to guide conversations to a better place, not to judge people, not to judge yourself. So that's one quadrant. Now, sometimes we fail on both dimensions at the same time, and I call that manipulative insincerity. And that sounds harsh, but I'll describe my own hero's path to manipulative insincerity in a moment. However, even though it's really fun to tell stories about somebody who behaved like a jerk, or somebody who was totally political, or backstabbing, or passive-aggressive, these two problems are not the most common problems, either at work or in any other relationship. By far the most common mistake that people make is when they do show that they care personally, and because they do care so much about that other person, they fail to challenge them directly. And this I call ruinous empathy. And so what I want to do for the next few minutes is just to motivate each of these quadrants, tell a personal story, and then I'll jump into some specific things you can do. So first of all, radical candor. One of the most common mistakes that people make when they see this framework is they think the best thing to do, the safest thing to do, is to hang out in ruinous empathy, which feels safer, and then build a relationship there, and then I'll move over to radical candor. But that's not how it works. The seeds of trust actually get sown in radical candor. Another mistake that people make is they think that radical candor is going to be hugely time-consuming. I got an email from a journalist who said, how long do these radical candor therapy sessions have to take? And the answer is, 1 to 3 minutes, not a long time. In fact, for me, the origin story of radical candor happened in the space of time it took a light to change on the streets of Manhattan. I had just gotten this dog, and golden retriever puppy, and I adored this puppy. And because I liked the dog so much, I had never spoken a cross word to her. And so she was totally out of control. So I'm walking along the street, she jumps in front of a cab. I pull her out of the way just in time, just before she gets squashed like a pancake. And this man on the street, perfect stranger, looks at me and he says, I can see you really love that dog. That's all he has to do to move up on the care personally axis. He didn't have to take me out to lunch. He didn't have to know my birthday. He did none of that stuff. I can see you really love that dog. But then this guy says to me, but you're going to kill that dog if you don't teach it to sit. Now he's got my full attention. And he looks at the ground and he says, sit. The dog sat. I had no idea the dog even knew what that meant. And I kind of look at this guy like, how'd you do that? And he looks back at me and he says, it's not mean, it's clear. And then the light changed and he walked off and left me with words to live by. So it only took a second, but it really changed my life. So you can really make a big difference to somebody by just pointing something out to them quickly and taking a couple of seconds to show that you understand, to make some kind of basic human connection. So that's radical candor story. Obnoxious aggression. Again, I will assert for the record that I am not a jerk overall, but I do sometimes behave like one. And I have it on good authority that all of you have made the same mistake at least once in your life, probably maybe once a day. And if you're anything like me, I'm like 5 times a day. And so here's a story. Again, shortly after I joined Google, I got into an argument with Larry Page about an AdSense policy. And I sent an email to him and 30 other people that said, Larry claims he wants to organize all the world's information, but if it'll make us a buck, he's willing to create clutter sites that muddle the world's information. And I'm like, why did I do that? Not my most politically astute move. And not radical candor either. Clear case of obnoxious aggression. I was talking about his personality when I should have been talking about the AdSense policy. I was talking in public when I should have been talking in private. I was talking over email when I should have been talking in person. Anyway, I was making all the classic mistakes. But the reason why I did it is worth kind of double-clicking on. I believe, and I bet all of you do too, that there's a special place in hell for people who kiss up and kick down, right? But that doesn't mean that doing the exact opposite makes a ton of sense either. There was no reason to kick Larry in the shins. He hadn't done anything to me. You know, he didn't deserve that. And so caring personally is something you owe equally to every person who you work with, regardless of whether they're the summer intern that you just hired and they haven't graduated high school, or whether they're the creator of the economic miracle of our time. Everybody deserves your common human decency. Now, of course, the cover-up is always worse than the crime. And I found out later, actually, Larry thought the email was kind of funny, but I really got into trouble in what I did next. So here's your hero's path to manipulative insincerity. A friend of mine called me up and said, "Why did you send that email? That was a ridiculous thing to do." And I realized that was a ridiculous thing to do. Why did I do that ridiculous thing? So the next time I saw Larry, I said to him, "Larry, I'm really sorry about that email. You were right. I was wrong." Two problems with that strategy. The first one was that I was lying. I didn't believe at all what I was saying. And the second problem was that Larry could tell I was lying. And he kind of looked at me like I was a pigeon that pooped on his shoulder, and he walked off. And it was one of those cringe moments. The guy sitting next to me patted me on the shoulder, and he said, he likes it better when you disagree with him. Just disagree next time. So, but it's not that uncommon of a mistake. When we find that we've made a mistake, when we've been a jerk, it's very tempting to back off your challenge. And instead of doing what you should do, which is to move up on the care personally dimension. So don't go in the wrong direction on the challenge directly dimension. Just take a second to go in the right direction on care personally. A false apology is something that we're all guilty of, and it never really works out that well. All right, so last but not least, ruinous empathy. The place where 85% of mistakes at work, not just at work, in a lot of human relationships get made. So my ruinous empathy story, I'm going to tell you about probably the worst moment in my career. I had hired this guy, we'll call him Bob. And Bob he was smart, he was charming, he was funny. He would do stuff like, we were at a management offsite playing one of those endless get-to-know-you games that everybody hates, but nobody dares admit this is a total waste of time. And Bob said, "I have a great idea, and it's going to be really fast," and we're all ears. And Bob says, "Let's just go around the table and confess what candy our parents used when potty training us." Weird, but fast. Hershey Kisses right here. Even weirder, we all remembered. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So anyway, we found this endearing. We liked Bob. One problem with Bob. He was doing terrible work. Absolutely terrible work. He would bring me something that he owed me, usually a couple of days late, and there was like shame in his eyes. He knew that it was not good. And in order to try to make him feel better, to buck him up, I'd say, "Bob, you're so awesome, you're so smart, everybody loves working with you, but this is a great start, maybe you could just make it a little better." And of course, he never did. And I never did anything about it. And after 10 months of this, the inevitable happened. And I realized if I didn't fire Bob, I was going to lose half my team. And so when I sat down to tell Bob where things stood, when I finished, a conversation I really should have started 10 months ago. When I finished, he pushed his chair back from the table. He looked at me right in the eye, and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And as that question is going around in my head with no good answer, he said, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me." And now I realize that I have failed Bob in 6 really important ways. I have failed to give him praise. First of all, I had failed to get praise, or more importantly, get criticism from him. I had failed to solicit feedback. Maybe I was doing something that was driving him so crazy he was forced to toke up in the bathroom. I don't know, and I never will, because I didn't ask him, and I wish I had. I should have. I also failed to give him praise that was meaningful. The kind of praise that I gave him was really just an ego salve. It was really just BS, frankly. And I failed to tell him when his work wasn't nearly good enough. And probably worst of all, I had failed to create an environment in which everyone around Bob would have given him praise that was meaningful, that would tell him what he did that was actually good, and when he was going off the rails. And because I had failed Bob in all these really important ways, I'm now having to fire him because of it. That's the really hard thing about management, is you learn all your hardest lessons on the backs of other people. And it was too late to fix the situation. Even Bob at this point agreed he should go. All I could do in that moment was make myself a really solemn promise that I would never make that mistake again, and that I would do everything that I could in order to help other people avoid making that mistake. And that was really the motivation for writing the book, for starting the company, and for coming up with this framework. I hope that it helps you avoid being in the situation that I was in with Bob. But of course, even if you like the stories and agree with the ideas, odds are you're all going to go back and keep doing what you always do. And I'm going to go back and keep these conversations are really helpful, but it's only a first step. And so what I want to leave you with are some specific ideas of things you can do to put these ideas into practice. Simple things you can do. Behavioral change doesn't happen in some eureka moment in your brain. It happens with little things you do every day. So I want to leave you with some ideas of little things you can do that'll help you and your culture move in the right direction. So first of all, get it. Solicit feedback before you start dishing it out. Don't dish it out till you prove you can take it. Then I'll talk about giving it. Then I'll talk about gauging it. Good guidance or feedback gets measured not at your mouth, but at the other person's ear. But it's kind of hard to know what's going on at the other person's ear. And I'll talk about things you can do to encourage it on your team. So let's start with getting it, with soliciting feedback. I think the best time to solicit feedback is at the very end of your one-on-one meetings. Your one-on-one meetings, mostly your employee should drive the agenda, but at the very end of the meeting, after your employee has gotten through all the items on their agenda, it's a good idea to ask for feedback. Now, it's hard as the boss to give feedback to your employees. It's like 5 times harder to give your boss feedback. So you've got to think hard about how you're going to pull the truth out of the people who work with you. And it's true, this is true up, down, and sideways. These principles apply if you decide you need to give some feedback to your boss. Start by soliciting feedback. And the first thing to do is to come up with a go-to question. Come up with a question that you can imagine falling trippingly from your tongue. So I worked with a coach when I was at Google. His name was Fred Kaufman. And the question that he taught me, which I liked, was, is there anything I could do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? I like the question. A good friend of mine, Krista Quarles, who's the CEO of OpenTable, said, I hate that question. I could never imagine saying those words. What I like to say to people is, tell me why I'm smoking crack. So the point is, whatever works for you. I mean, don't use my question if it sounds too corny. Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel when Intel was Intel, said that the way that he liked to ask the question was, there's one more thing. It's like, did you get that from Steve Jobs? No, I didn't. We both got it from Columbo, the detective show. So you can get your go-to question from anywhere, but the point of the go-to question is that it's got to be a question that that's hard for people to say, oh no, everything's fine. Or if you say, do you have any feedback for me? I guarantee you I know the answer. No, I don't. Everything's great. So you got to come up with a way to ask the question that's most likely to drag something out of people. Now, after you ask your question, the next step is to embrace the discomfort. For a long time in my career, I thought that if I just made people feel really comfortable, they would tell me what they really thought. But the only thing that's going to make people comfortable is to say nothing. And so what you need to do is you need to make it more uncomfortable for them to say nothing than for them to say something. And luckily, there's a really simple technique you can use. Shut your mouth and count to 6, like 1, 1,000. I only just made it to 3, and I bet all of you were feeling uncomfortable. If I were going to embrace the discomfort, I'd go all the way to 6. So if you can manage to keep your mouth shut for 6 seconds, the other person is in all likelihood going to tell you something, because almost nobody can endure that much silence. Of course, if they don't tell you anything, even after 6 seconds, give them a day or two. You don't have to put them on the spot. Some people do better if they have a little preparation time. In Japan, the leaders at Toyota realized that the culture was such that it made it incredibly difficult for people to criticize authority. And so what they did to embrace the discomfort was they painted a big red box at the end of the assembly line. And after people had worked there for 1 week, they had to go stand in the red box. And they weren't allowed to leave the red box until they had criticized 3 things they had seen at work that week. So anyway, that's an extreme version of embrace it. I never had the courage to paint a red box by my desk, but come up with some version of embrace the discomfort. So now you've dragged somebody out on a conversational limb that they didn't want to be on. The most important thing you can do next, and they've said something, the most important thing you can do next is to listen with the intent to understand, not to reply. It's perfectly normal, totally human, to feel defensive when somebody gives you feedback, when somebody criticizes you. Because when you're soliciting feedback, let's face it, you're not fishing for compliments, you're soliciting criticism. And that's okay that you feel defensive, but how you manage your normal defensive reaction is everything. Because if you give vent to that defensiveness, you will never, ever get feedback from that person again. So simple technique is to simply repeat what they said back. Don't say you agree or disagree. Just check for understanding. Make sure you understand. And then the final step is to reward the candor. So if you agree with the feedback, rewarding the candor is pretty straightforward. You simply fix the problem, and you tell the person you fixed the problem. If it takes a while to fix the problem, you keep the person abreast of the steps you're taking to fix the problem. However, it's a little bit harder if you disagree with the feedback that you got, if you disagree with the criticism. And this is a talk called Radical Candor. This is not a talk called, thank you, sir, may I have another, right? You're allowed to disagree with it, but you've got to disagree. Sometimes the only way to reward the candor is with a fuller explanation of your perspective on the situation. But don't give that in the heat of the moment. Find the 5% of whatever the person said that you can agree with. Focus on that, and then say, but I'd like to think about the rest of this a little bit more and come back to you. And don't let it drop like a hot potato. Do get back to them and say, I want to explain to you why I disagree. Right? Sometimes a full, respectful explanation is a good reward for the candor. Pretending to agree when you disagree is a path to manipulative insincerity, like I had with Larry. So that's some advice for soliciting feedback. Having solicited feedback, it's now a good idea to begin giving it. Now remember, feedback is both praise and criticism, and you should give more praise than criticism. But don't don't do this according to some sort of ratio, because if you do, you wind up saying, I love your earrings, your work is terrible, but great shoes, or something ridiculous like, your work is great, by the way. So you wind up saying things that are sort of banal and meaningless. So don't try to manage by the numbers, but do focus on the good stuff. Focus on the good stuff that you really see, that you really admire, and don't be shy about giving voice to the things that are good. That's all for the positive. The best time to give feedback is in these 2-minute impromptu conversations. Like you see something, you say something. Take words from I think that's from the MTA in New York, adopted by all kinds of other organizations. But you see something, you say something. Don't wait. And the spirit with which to have these impromptu conversations, and by the way, these conversations, these 2-minute conversations, I would argue are the building block of management. This is the core part of your job. So even if you finish a meeting, you're busy, you got to go to the next meeting, and you really have to pee, hold it, have the conversation, be late to your next meeting. Like this is an important part of your job. Is saying these things to people right in the moment. And it's often worth it to be late to your next meeting in order to have this quick conversation. So make sure that you go into these conversations, these 2-minute conversations, humble. You may be wrong about your feedback. People often ask me, well, what if I'm not sure I'm right? And I said, if you're sure you're right, that's when you're in trouble. If you're not sure you're right, you're probably going to give pretty good feedback. I call it candor instead of truth, because if I say to you, I'm going to tell you the truth, like all of a sudden I'm kind of implying that what I'm saying is right and your point of view is wrong by default. And that's the idea of candor, is that I'm going to tell you what I see, and I want you to tell me what you see, and together we're going to get to a better place. So that's the idea. So give it humbly. Give it helpfully. You're not giving praise or criticism to prove that you're the arbiter of what's good or bad, to prove that you're better than somebody, or to kick somebody in the shins, or to be patronizing. You're giving both praise. You're giving praise to help people know what to do more of. You're giving criticism to help people know what to fix. And if you just take a second to say, I want to tell you something because I think it'll help you, it makes a huge difference in the way that they hear what you're about to say. You're not going to tell them something to prove that you're better than they are in some way. Give it right away. The longer you wait, the more things fester. Has anybody ever had a relationship where somebody is doing something, and it's often a little thing, right? But you don't tell them, you don't tell them, you don't tell them, and finally it drives you so crazy and you explode over some little thing, and then you feel ridiculous. And you look ridiculous, frankly. And yet this kind of thing happens all the time. If I had told Bob earlier, he may have changed his lunchtime habits in the bathroom and done better work, right? But I didn't. So say it right away. Say it in person. If Cheryl hadn't been talking to me in person, she wouldn't have seen me do this thing with my hand, and then she wouldn't have known that she had to go further out on the challenge directly dimension than she expected to have to go. 80%, 85%, your numbers will vary, but the vast majority of communication is actually nonverbal. So don't give feedback over text or email or in writing. Do it, if you have remote teams, at least do it over video chat. Make sure that you can see how the person is reacting. And it's okay, by the way, if the person reacts with some emotion. I think often the reason that we send these messages over text or email or whatever, put it in a tool, is because then we don't have to see the emotional reaction. But if we don't see how the feedback is landing, then we can't adjust. We can't possibly adjust. We can't know whether we should be going further out on the challenge directly dimension or whether we should be reacting with compassion to some sort of emotional reaction the person is having. So do it in person so that you can adjust. And also eliminate these words from your vocabulary. Eliminate the words, "don't take it personally." When you give somebody feedback, especially if it's criticism, they spend more time at work probably than in any other activity in their life. And it's natural that they're going to be upset if they screwed up. It's okay if they're not upset, if they don't care at all, you got a different set of problems. So eliminate those words from your vocabulary. It's okay if somebody reacts with some emotion. Your job in that situation is to react with compassion to the emotion. When you criticize, do it in private. When you praise, do it in public. It seems kind of obvious, but a lot of people get this wrong. And last but not least, make sure that you don't either praise or criticize somebody's personality. For the same reason that you wouldn't say you're a moron, it's not helpful to say you're a genius. It's really hard to know what to do more of if the praise is you're a genius. And it's really hard to know what to fix if somebody says the problem is you're a moron. So make sure you're not criticizing personality attributes. You can use the situation, behavior, impact. When Cheryl criticized me, she didn't say, "you are stupid and insecure." She said, "when you said every third word," there was even a little data, "in the meeting, it made you sound stupid and insecure." Huge difference between the two. Much easier to hear one than the other. So that's some advice about how to give criticism and praise. Same principles apply to both praise and criticism. Now, of course, I said before, and it's worth repeating, radical candor gets measured not at your mouth, but at the other person's ear. So how do you know how the other person is taking it? How can you understand what they're hearing? I think that one of the things you can do that is incredibly helpful is to begin to share this vocabulary. And if you don't like the words in this framework, come up with your own framework. But having a shared vocabulary about what makes good criticism, what makes bad criticism, what makes good praise, what makes bad praise, can be incredibly helpful. So use this sort of framework or use another one that you like. But make sure that you can say, after you have given somebody some feedback, either praise or criticism, how did that feel to you? And if there's like one of 4 words they can use, you can more easily correct. And we're also working on building some software that'll help you gauge it. So if you want to sign up for that, it's alpha@radicalcandor.com. But I want to explain to you the most common pattern that I see. Your fear when you're giving feedback is that the other person is going to think you're a jerk. That's the most common fear that people have when giving feedback. And yet, when you're receiving feedback, when you're on the other end, your biggest fear is that the other person is pulling their punches, that you're not hearing the full story, that they're actually being ruinously empathetic. And as soon as you see this dynamic at play, that your fear is kind of the very opposite of their fear, it becomes way easier to move over towards radical candor, which is part of why a shared vocabulary is so helpful. When I taught at Apple, we had a slightly different version of this framework and printed it up. And when people would say, you know, I think you're being ruinously empathetic, it was much easier for people to just say it very clearly. So keep that in mind and ask people, how is this helpful? How did that land for you? Another common thing is that people often think they've given somebody some critical feedback and the other person heard praise. Happens all the time where somebody's working for me and they're like, I'm so frustrated with so-and-so. I'm like, you got to go tell them. Did you tell them? Yes, I told them. And then I bump into so-and-so and they're like, what? It happens all the time. So make sure you're clear. It's not mean, it's clear. So finally, encouraging it. This is where you get your real leverage as a leader, because there's more of other people than there are of you. And there are a couple of things that I suggest. One is require clean escalation. This is another term coined by Fred Kaufman. And the other is create a speak truth to power process. So what I mean by clean escalation is don't let people talk badly about each other behind their backs to you, right? So I once, early in my career, had two people, we'll call them Charlie and Daniel, working for me. Charlie and Daniel hated each other. And all I wanted, of course, was for everybody to get along and get their work done. And so Charlie would come to me and complain about Daniel, and just wanting to create peace and avoid politics and get everybody focused on the work, I would go to Daniel and I would say, Daniel, you know, if you could just do this, this, and this, it'd be much easier for you to work with Charlie. Now Daniel is pissed off because he realizes that Charlie has come and talked to me about him behind his back. And so now Daniel starts pouring poison in my ear about Charlie. And now I run to Charlie and I start telling him about all the things he could do to make it easier to work for him to work. And now I've created a real political mess. And all I thought I was doing was being empathetic, being a good listener. I wasn't. I was stirring the political pot. So make sure that you don't let people talk badly about each other to you. That's clean escalation. Instead, just say, Charlie, did you talk to Daniel? He's got ears. And if you did talk to him and you can't work it out, then you can come to me together and we'll try to work it out. Now, the next thing that is really helpful to do is to create a speak truth to power process. This is also called skip level meetings. And you've got to make it really easy for people to criticize their boss to you. I think I'm at time. There you go. So you've got to, it's really hard, when there's a power imbalance, it's really hard for people to be radically candid. And so you've got to make it exceptionally easy. And so you can't just say, everybody should speak their mind. Go to each of your, if you're a manager of managers, go to their team without them, find out how they could be a better leader, and then bring those suggestions back to the person and help the person make the changes. And ask the team, what can this person do so that you can tell him or her directly, rather than having to go through me. There's a long FAQ about these skip level meetings in the book if you're interested. But what I want to do now is to take a few questions and to encourage you all to put these ideas into practice. Come up with your go-to question. If you want to try using the app, use the app. We've got a podcast, we've got a book. And make this part of your day-to-day, because it really will make a big difference. So thank you very much. Happy to take some questions. Yeah?
When you talk about feedback, is it normally negative? Do you have a definition for feedback?
Yes, so the question is, when I talk about feedback, is it normally negative? No. Feedback, and in the book I call it guidance, not feedback, because feedback is screechy and makes us want to put our hand over our ears, and guidance is something that most of us long for. And guidance is praise and criticism. And the way to create a culture of guidance is to solicit it and then give it and then encourage it. Does that help?
Yeah, and so does the same, I'm just going to say positive feedback or positive guidance, does the same apply?
Yes, yes. So for the same reason that it doesn't make sense to criticize personality, it doesn't make sense to praise personality attributes, because that's not teaching the people what to do more of. If you've read Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck, she has a couple of chapters in the book about praise and the importance of giving praise in a way that doesn't say, oh, you're a genius in math because you got this right. Because then the corollary is the next time when they get the problem wrong, which is inevitable, they're not a genius in math, and then they want to avoid taking risks. So you want to give both praise and criticism helpfully, humbly, immediately, in person. Sometimes you praise somebody and they kind of look at you like they're annoyed, and you want to understand why that is. You want to praise, the difference is you want to praise in public, criticize in private, and in neither case do you want to make it about personality. Question in the back?
Thank you, Kim. That's great.
Thank you.
That's awesome thing. And I'm from Intel, so I appreciate the Andy Grove.
Oh, excellent. I love, Andy Grove is one of my heroes.
Great, mine too. For those of us who have global teams and maybe only see people on our teams or people we want to be encouraging and giving great feedback to regularly, but maybe only see in person once or twice a year, what do you recommend?
Yeah.
For 4-H?
Yes. So managing people far away, a few specific recommendations. One is make good use of video technology. If you can see somebody's expressions, it makes a huge difference. I was managing a global team when I was at Google. We were in 10 different countries, and I was pregnant with twins. And when I asked my doctor about travel, she was like, well, what's more important to you, the trip or the hearts and lungs of your children? I was like, well, I guess I won't be taking that trip. And so I spent a lot of time on video conference. I was pretty religious about not just emailing and not just calling, but actually being able to see people. I also find that if you meet more frequently, if you're in the same place with somebody, meeting with them once a week, once every other week is good enough. But if somebody's far away, meeting with them even for short periods of time, 2 or 3 or 4 times a week, even if you just call them for 5 minutes on a video call, you begin to get a flavor for what's going on with them in a way that you get naturally when you're in the same office without having to take the time to make a call. Another thing that I used to do that was really helpful was I would work 1 week a quarter European hours, and I would work 1 week a quarter Asian hours. And that was way better than going there. I mean, it was still kind of a pain in the neck, but it was way better than the flight. And that was helpful. So it was like kind of jet lag, but not quite jet lag, I don't know. But that kind of, and I would like have beers with the team at 9 in the morning, California time or whatever. Like I really went all in on the theater. I mean, of course I was pregnant, so I didn't really have that much beer, but I had a little bit. So anyway, those kinds of things were helpful. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for sharing stories and the tips. How do you apply writing of candor when you manage it upwards?
Yes.
I think it's very important for a lot of us.
Yes. In theory, radical candor is the same up, down, and sideways. These are relationships. These are human relationships, and so relationships don't respect hierarchy. So it's the same stuff. You should solicit feedback before you give it. When it comes time to give feedback, focus on the good stuff before you point out the bad things. And you don't need to point out every single bad thing, right? Good advice for a relationship is leave 1 or 2 things unsaid every day. Like you focus on the important things. So it's the same. However, there's an important difference with your boss, which is there's a power differential and you can get fired. I one time gave this talk and somebody tweeted at me afterwards, tried radical candor on my boss, got fired. And I was like, oh my God, I feel terrible. I'm so sorry. How can I help? Like, I know a lot of people. Can I help you find a job? And the guy said, no, I found another job already. I'm fine. Thank you. I'm in a better place. So So I want to acknowledge that you're in a more vulnerable situation with your boss than you are with your employees, at least in the short term. And it often feels like you're in a more vulnerable situation than you in fact are. But again, if you start by soliciting feedback, you're sort of showing you're open to it. And then focus on the good stuff. You probably don't want to praise your boss in public because it's going to make you look like you're kissing up. But the things you genuinely mean, take a moment to say them. If there's stuff you want your boss to do more of, tell them. And then when it comes time to criticizing your boss, say, there's a problem I see, and I have some ideas for how to fix it. Like, ask yourself the question, am I part of the problem or part of the solution? Make sure you're part of the solution. And then say, can I tell you about it? Almost nobody's going to say no. If they do say no, then polish up your resume and start looking for a new boss, is my advice. But if they say yes, explain it. Notice how they react. If they react well, you can talk about something bigger the next time. I will say that when I have worked for people who were belittling, I one time worked for this guy who was literally belittling. In fact, he would say things to me like, you don't need to worry your pretty little head about that. It made me so angry that I literally shrunk half an inch in the year that I worked for this man. And when I quit, I got my half an inch right back, happily. But it can be really frustrating. And I happened to bump into the guy 10 years later, and we had a glass of wine together. And I realized, I'm not saying he was a lovely human being. He had his issues. But I realized he wasn't nearly as bad as all that. The thing that had caused me to shrink half an inch was not his behavior, but my reaction. I felt ashamed of myself for my lack of reaction. I felt ashamed that I hadn't told him that his behavior was so unacceptable. And that was what made me so angry at him. So I think it really is very important to give your boss some critical feedback. If your boss is doing something that's driving you crazy, you should find a way to tell them. And if you can't find a way to tell them, you're probably going to quit anyway. So you may as well take a little risk. Another question? Yeah?
How should you have fixed the email scenario instead of apologizing?
Oh, so the way I would have handled it differently, hopefully I wouldn't have sent that email in the first place. But having done it, I think the first thing I should have done was to be more humble. I would have tried to understand why Larry thought the way he did about the AdSense policy. There's a very common mistake that is described really well in Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. When we encounter a hard problem, and the AdSense algorithm was a hard problem, it's very tempting to substitute the hard problem for an easier one. It was very easy to say the problem here is Larry is greedy, which A was wrong and B was irrelevant, and very hard to understand the AdSense algorithm. So if I had to do it over again, I would have spent more time trying to understand the AdSense algorithm before launching into this criticism. And if I, having taken the effort to understand it, still disagreed, I would have gone to Larry in private and explained to him why, in a way that was respectful and not just kicking him in the shins. Does that help? And I wouldn't have lied and said that I thought I was wrong when actually I thought I was right. That didn't do any good.
I think it's awesome that you didn't say once in your entire presentation.
I'm sure I did.
I'll have to figure out how to do that myself.
S&P Communications. Well, and then give a talk a lot of times with a story in which you talk about saying and then you become hyper aware of. I did, when I first started giving this talk, I would still say and then I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. So it's good training.
Thank you. My question is, how do you apply some of the radical candor across cultural differences?
Yes.
I've had to deal with that as a sales manager, and a person coming from another country into our culture who was making a lot of mistakes, but you want to be respectful. I learned as much as I could, but it was really hard for me to talk about that.
Yes.
In a constructive way, because I was really put off by it. So
it's really difficult. Yes. So again, fundamental principle is radical candor gets measured not at your mouth, but at the other person's ear. And that's why it's going to be different in different relationships. It's going to be different with different people, even from the same culture. And it's going to be different across cultures, whether it's company culture or country culture. So I remember, in fact, when I moved from New York to California to take the job at Google, somebody sent me a map of the United States. And there was a guy in New York saying, F you, and thinking, have a nice day, and a guy in California saying, have a nice day, and thinking, F you. And I was like, oh boy, it's a different kind of culture. And then I found myself managing teams in these 10 different countries. So radical candor sounds really different in Tel Aviv than in Tokyo, believe me. And so when I was managing the team in Tokyo, I couldn't even call it radical candor. I called it polite persistence, right? So polite was sort of how they showed that they cared personally, and persistence was how they challenged directly. But in Tel Aviv, the kind of politeness would have been misconstrued as insincere, right? It would have shown the opposite of care personally. It would have been almost like a sign of disrespect. So you have to adjust for different cultures, and you have to make sure that people know that you care. It's not enough to care personally. You have to show it, and different people are going to understand it differently. So you've got to make sure that's why gauging it is so important. And gauging it for the individual and gauging it for the culture. Does that help a little bit?
it does. Thank you.
Any more questions?
One last question, and then we should all get a glass of wine. Radical candor juice.
If someone gets defensive, or you talked about the emotional part, so if they get defensive or they get into, you see they're really in fear or they get angry, is there a particular way that you address that?
Yes, so when somebody gets angry, I think the best thing to do is to say, I can see this is really making you mad. Just call it out. I can see I just pissed you off. And don't say, I'm sorry about what I said. Don't back off your challenge. Don't say, it's not that big of a deal, because it probably is that big of a deal. That's why you took the energy to say it. But say, I'm sorry you're really mad. I'm not saying this to kick you in the shins. I'm telling you this because I want to help you. I want to help you grow. And maybe I'm wrong, but tell me why I'm wrong. And tell me in a respectful way why I'm wrong. Maybe tell me tomorrow why, if they're yelling, if they're really upset. But be open to the fact that you might be wrong, and tell them. Just take a second to say, I'm not telling you this because it gives me pleasure to upset you. I'm upset that you're upset, but I want to help you fix this thing. Does that help a little bit? It's the thing that has been the most surprising, the most consistently surprising to me, and I was raised in Memphis, Tennessee. I was born and bred for manipulative insincerity. The thing that has been the most surprising to me about radical candor is that people genuinely appreciate it more often than not. You're often bracing yourself for somebody to be really mad, and then they're not that mad. They're actually grateful. It's remarkable. So I know it's time to get, now 3 glasses, by the way, is obnoxious aggression juice. So just get 1 glass of wine. But also buy the book. We have Books, Inc. in the corner. Took me 4 years to write the book. They spent all evening here, so feel free to buy the book. It's a great book, if I do say so myself. And I'll sign them. And my signature is not that great, but the book is really great. So thank you all so much. I am really grateful for your time this evening.